It has been 5 long years since Opeth last graced our ears with their presence, and I have been champing at the proverbial for another slice of Ackerfeldt's signature songwriting genius. So the cat's out of the bag, we all know he's growling again. But is this enough? Is this a return to their glorious death metal days? Is this just an extension of the so-called Opeth era? Or is this something else entirely? Guys, gals and non-binary pals, my name is Ian, this is Rhyme Signatures, and we are once again opening the lid on the best new releases in prog rock and metal.
When I say now, you guys are going to headbang without music, and that's what we want to see, okay? I'll count you in. I'll say now when you start headbanging, okay? 1, 2, 3, now.
Oh boy, where do we start with this one? Right, unless you've been living under a very large rock, you'll have a pretty decent idea as to who Opeth are, and you'll likely be aware that they made their start in the mid-90s as a purely death metal band. And they started slowly but surely dribbling in elements of progressive rock until one fateful day in 1999 when they dropped Still Life, they evolved into the favourite child of both the death metal and the prog metal worlds. They continued this trend by releasing some of the, quite frankly, greatest albums of all time one after the other. Still Life begat Blackwater Park, begat Deliverance and Damnation, begat Ghost Reveries, begat Watershed. And it felt like Opeth were on an enormous upward swing incapable of controversy or criticism. And then Heritage came out, and it was largely met with a collective what the f*** from their established fanbase. But it did see them begin to attract a whole new audience. The lo-fi, old-school progressive rock stylings and themes of this album would come to define the many albums that followed into what collectively became known as the Opeth era. Now, I'm not going to patronise any of you or put on a false face here. I was incredibly disappointed when Heritage first came out, and with each subsequent release I was hoping that it was a one-off experiment and we'd be back to face-melting riffs and mountain-quaking growls before you knew it. But of course we all know how that panned out. With 4 albums into the Opeth era, it seemed that this was who the band were now, and you know, I started to learn to love both sides of the same coin, even if I do still prefer their older material. But then the first single of this new album dropped, and sweet baby Jesus on a toasted pretzel bun, Mickey Ackerfeldt delivered a bellowing growl for the ages. It felt like a rallying cry to the old fans, a sign that he saw us, he heard us, and he was ready to deliver a body blow of Opeth proportions once again. Well, let me tell you, this ain't Opeth. If you're looking for Ghost Reveries the sequel or Blackwater Park Part 2 Electric Boogaloo, you won't find it here. But this isn't Heritage 2.0 either. This is something new, something frankly astonishing, and even now with this being their 14th studio album, Opeth have managed to reinvent themselves again while giving both warring sides of their fanbase something to enjoy without alienating either.
He invested a lot of money all over the world, and he's going to use it to film some of his film for his film company. It involves horses and sex.
Okay, so approaching an album of this magnitude when it comes to reviewing it, especially when you're on a pretty tight schedule to get this out in a timely manner, can be quite tricky to make sure you get all your thoughts in order and all your ducks in a row, etc, etc. So bear with me a little while I do my best to externalise my inner monologue that's been playing while listening to this album. First off, no, I haven't had access to this one prior to release, so there is going to be a degree of honeymoon period around my commentary here. But I think what struck me most about The Last Will and Testament is just how disarmingly theatrical it all is. Previous albums from Opeth have always given off a sense of being a metal album or a prog rock album, but never the sort of thing I'd expect to hear from a small indie theatre in a gentrified part of an otherwise run-down town. As I'm sure most of you are aware, this is a proper concept album, and the first explicitly so since Still Life 25 years ago. So it's been interesting to see how the lyricism and songwriting has evolved over time to accommodate for this kind of broad strokes narrative. I won't get into spoilers as 1, I don't want to ruin the surprises for everyone, and 2, I haven't had the time to fully comprehend the storyline yet. But the gist is that it's set after World War I, and the titular last will and testament of the deceased head of the family is being read out. History is revealed, drama happens, and it all gets a little bit artsy-fartsy. Which is another thing I can point a finger at this album for. I feel this is subjectively the most art house of all of Opeth's albums. I mean, yes, you can make the argument for the likes of In Cauda Venenum or Pale Communion, etc., but the sheer scope and scale of the musical ideas and phrasing in The Last Will and Testament is a massive step up for my ears. You've got your multiple characters, these dark and these gothic themes, the jazzy interludes, and a blink and you'll miss it kind of pacing that keeps the album's relatively brief 51 minutes runtime ticking over at a blinding pace. So let's talk about the one big obvious point that surrounded this album in the run-up to its release, the return of Akerfeldt's signature demonic growl. Honestly, I've missed this so much. Hearing that distinctive bellow coming out of my speakers on an Opeth studio album for the first time since 2008's Watershed was like manna from heaven. But for as good as it is to hear him doing this again, and for a man who's now in his 50s, it's still one of the best rumbles in the industry, I was surprised to find myself thinking that this isn't the best thing about The Last Will and Testament. I mean, sure, it's great and all that, don't get me wrong, and it fits the mood and themes of the album perfectly when it's brought out. It's always used just the right amount without ever bordering on pandering to the older fans. But I found myself far more entranced by the instrumentation on the album than I have done in recent years. Newcomer Valtteri Vaininen on the drums, replacing Martin Axelrod, who's played with the band for some 16 years prior, does an absolutely incredible job. There are moments on The Last Will and Testament where I genuinely forget to listen to anything but his absolutely remarkable skin slapping. He is honestly an extraordinary talent and has some of the most complex and intricate playing from any drummer I've heard this year. Martin Mendez, of course, continues to prove his worth as one of the world's greatest bass players here, with his signature thumps and grooves providing one of the most well-textured and exciting soundscapes the band has ever produced. The Last Will and Testament's atmosphere is second to none. The whole experience feels so dark, oppressive, and threatening. Now there's moments of light amidst the darkness, yes, and while the death metal blood does run through the centre of the album, it's not where that darkness stems from. It is the narrative that gives this album its potent flavour. It is as sepia-toned and stuffy as the cover art implies it will be, and it is a delightful slice of melodrama that I honestly can't get enough of. Paragraph 2 has this incredible driving riff at around 1 minute 40 or so, with Jethro Tull's Ian Anderson lending his first of many narrations underneath it all. His contributions to the album really do help make this something unique and special amidst Opeth's discography. I just thank God he doesn't do any actual singing, as if the rock flute and the zealot gene were anything to go by, his actual song vocals might have tanked any of the good graces of the rest of the band. This is one of those albums where it's hard to really choose a favourite track, because honestly they're all pretty damn good. You'll likely all have heard the singles of Paragraph 1 and 3, and if you haven't, then they're easy highlights. Plenty of dynamics, dips and dives, and it's a wild tapestry of creative ideas are the order of the day. And honestly, that's pretty much what follows for most of the album. The run from Paragraph 4 through to 6 is probably my favourite run of tracks on the album though, Anderson's flute playing really shining through where it's needed, and with both Akerfeldt and Åkesson pushing out some of their most interesting and challenging guitar playing since Ghost Reveries for my money. A lot of the atmospherics can be well attributed to Joachim Svalberg's keyboards, never feeling forced or overbearing, which is a problem that a lot of progressive metal bands have. Here they are used tastefully and subtly, helping to make for a well-balanced album that ultimately straddles the line between death metal and prog rock better than the band has ever managed before. And I think this is where I will mark The Last Will and Testament. This isn't a death metal album. In fact, I'd say there's barely any real death metal at all on here. Outside of the well-executed and well-placed growls, I would subjectively say this is more of a progressive death rock album. It's theatrical and, dare I say it, camp in places. It's incredibly pretentious and artistic and never really sways towards the aggression or tonality of albums like My Arms Your Hearse, Deliverance or Ghost Reveries. But yet it still manages to feel dark enough in its theming and tonality to be paying respects to the band's past but also looking towards their future.
I want to do something that you're going to find extremely annoying. Okay?
Okay, so let's try and pull things back a little bit here. I'm a rampant Opeth fanboy, sure, but even I can recognise that The Last Will and Testament is a flawed masterpiece. One of the things that struck me hardest when I sat down to put pen to the proverbial here was just how many times I had to listen to this album for a lot of the core melodies and riffs to actually stay with me. This is a record that initially, at least, exists in the moment-to-moment. There's very little on here that I would call explicitly memorable. Whereas you look at earlier albums, I can instinctively a cappella large chunks of a lot of them, but I'm still struggling to do so with The Last Will and Testament, despite having listened to this album over a dozen times in the last 2 days. Now this is by and large, I feel, down to the songwriting feeling extremely fast-paced. There's not a lot of situations where some of the more interesting riffs or passages are explored for particularly long. There's a sense of the band taking a bite out of one idea, and then halfway through chewing it, they see something else that they want to try, and so immediately launch into that, before you've had any kind of real opportunity to let the previous idea sit on your palate for long enough to really appreciate. It makes for an album that feels like it was shortened into something designed to be all flash-bang theatricality, and I feel this is one of those rare situations where I think an album would have benefited from an extra 10 to 15 minutes of runtime. The overall 51 minutes definitely puts this on the shorter side of the band's discography, and in this instance I just don't think the shorter runtime is fully justified. I would have killed for some of the ideas on paragraphs 2, 6 and 7 in particular to be expanded on, as it all feels, I don't want to say rushed, but hurried along I think is the right way to describe it. In all honesty though, I still feel this is just nitpicking on my part, as this album has absolutely been worth the 5-year wait, and it's incredibly refreshing to hear the band not cave to pressure and release an album directly comparable to Ghost Reveries or Blackwater Park. The reactionary part of my brain would of course loved something like that, but when you've got bands like Ubiquity carrying the torch for this kind of sound, why not let Opeth just be Opeth and do whatever it is that's sparking their artistic muse?
I want to hear Martin Mendes and Axe play a Michael Jackson song.
So what else can I possibly say about Opeth's The Last Will and Testament? It's not often that we get bands releasing their 14th studio album and still finding new tricks and toys to play with. But if any band was going to be able to do it, I'm not in the least bit surprised that it was Opeth. I've honestly fallen in love with the album's narrative melodrama, and despite some initial disappointments that the death metal elements weren't a bit stronger, I've come to appreciate and enjoy The Last Will and Testament for what it is. This is a fascinating concoction, managing to feel respectful of the band's rich and varied history, pulling at the juiciest and most compelling parts of their career to make an album that feels genuinely progressive in its explorations and themes. Getting such a strong, narrative-driven album from the band after so long has been a real treat, and the lyricism on offer here is amongst the best in their entire discography. Now, I don't really feel that this album will appeal to everyone, especially if you were expecting a solid return to Blackwater Park based on the hinge that was Ackerfeld's growls returning to the fold. But I also do worry that this element might potentially drive off the fans that the band has picked up since Heritage. But I can't help but respect the band for sticking to their artistic integrity and releasing music that adheres to their current muse. Now, I pre-ordered this one absolutely yonks ago, and I would continue to recommend grabbing this one in physical format. The Last Will and Testament may not be the new course that the band is going for, but this is a fascinating change in direction nonetheless. And for a band as deep into their career as Opeth to still be able to keep their core audience guessing is no mean feat that deserves to be celebrated. This is all, of course, guys, just my opinion, so if you loved this one or if you hated this one, please talk to me about your experiences with The Last Will and Testament in the comments down below. Please do drop me a thumbs up if you liked the video, please do tell all your friends about little old me, and please do consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already. But until next time, guys, as always, keep your rhyme signatures pretty odd.